So good morning, Dr. Hartwell. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. I already introduced you to the live students we have here, but I'll read a short piece of your bio for our online audience. So Dr. Leon Hartwell is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He is also a senior associate at LSE Ideas London School of Economics, co-founder and chair of the Russia-Ukraine Dialogues, and a former Sotorov Fellow. His research interests include conflict resolution, genocide, transitional justice, diplomacy, and democracy. So today we have the pleasure of being joined by you, Dr. Hartwell, and listening to that beautiful piece that you wrote on Raphael Lemkin, who is someone that we have briefly mentioned in our class as we studied the concept of genocide. But it certainly is wonderful to see him analyzed from such an original perspective and his role as a negotiator. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And now I am having trouble sharing my screen, and I have no idea why. I'm so sorry. Okay, there we go. All right, we are in good shape, actually. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Ofelia, and also for having me. It's a great honor to engage your students on a topic that is very dear to my heart. I want to combine two topics that are of interest to me today. One is, of course, on Raphael Lemkin. I've lived in 5 different countries around the world for 3 years or more, and I've traveled to over 40 different countries around the world. And in every country has some form of history related to this issue of genocide. And of course, we're talking about it today largely thanks to Raphael Lemkin, who devoted his entire life to criminalizing genocide, this great crime. The other thing that I want to focus on today is, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically how genocide pertains to everything that's happened since the February 2022 escalation of this war. So since March last year, I've chaired over 40 different discussions with over 110 different experts, looking at a variety of aspects related to the Russia-Ukraine war. So I'm going to kick it off by focusing on Lemkin and kind of give you a taste of how he came up with this idea of genocide and why. He was born in the year 1900 exactly. He grew up in a village near a town in Volkovysk, which is technically today part of Belarus. But Raphael Lemkin grew up identifying as a Polish Jew. I think as a kid, he must have heard a number of stories in the area where he grew up of pogroms against Jews in his area. And he also faced quite a bit of discrimination as a Jew growing up in Poland. When he was at the age of 11, he read a book called Quo Vadis, which is Latin for "Where Are You Going?" By Henry Sienkiewicz. And it was quite significant because in the book, it focused on the Emperor Nero and how he discriminated against Christians. He fed them to the lions. And the young Lemkin wanted to know from his mother, well, why don't the authorities intervene to stop these actions? He couldn't understand it. So that was one of his early introductions to this idea of genocide. I mean, and if you compare it to kids today, the age of 11, kids generally read Harry Potter. So it shows you the seriousness of this young child, Raphael Lemkin. Then he went on to study philology. This is something that really served him quite well in life. He was very prolific in terms of learning new languages. And I've counted at least, I think, 11 languages in which he was fluent in. And I think he could read and write in another 3 or so languages. And when I say he was quite fluent in these languages, he didn't just put it on his CV. He wrote to his brother in Hebrew. He translated Polish legislation into English so that Americans could also access and understand what was going on in Poland. He was translating German decrees into English so that there's evidence, so he was very, very prolific, and it also helped him as a negotiator later on, because he was able to speak in a language that people could understand in their own language. Um, then during his university years, he then decided he wanted to kind of switch over from philology to rather to study law. And one of the things that really interested Lemkin during that time was this case of Soghomon Tellurian, who murdered Talat Pasha. Soghomon was this young Armenian individual who he was a survivor, basically, because many of his family members and friends had been killed during the Armenian genocide. And Talat Pasha was, of course, one of the orchestrators of that genocide. And Soghomon went up to him, murdered him, and then was put on trial, because I think it happened in Germany. So he was put on trial in 1921. And the young Lemkin turned to his law professor and said, well, professor, why is this one individual being put on trial for the murder of one person, but Talat Pasha, who was responsible for killing over 1 million people, he never faced trial? And his professor responded, well, there is no such crime. So crime did not happen because it wasn't defined as a crime. And I think that was early on a challenge for Raphael Lemkin. Remember, he was 21 years old at this time. But it was a challenge for him to focus on criminalizing genocide under international law. And what you have to remember, and I want to really stress this throughout also, is that international law takes an incredibly long time to evolve and develop. So the timeline is really significant in terms of how rapidly Lemkin was able to kind of push his idea of genocide into the mainstream international law, as you will see. So in the 30s, he was largely a legal practitioner. He was a writer. He was a law professor. He was quite a prolific writer also. And I think his goal was to publish at least 1 book every year. And I think he succeeded in that in the first 10 years of his life. I don't know how he did it, but he did it. And then he basically became consumed with these other issues. Lemkin was incredibly smart, and I think, like, if you study him a little bit, you'll realize he could have been anything. He could have been a lawyer, made a lot of money. He could have been a great businessman. He could have worked in the corporate sector and just about do anything. But he basically died in poverty years later at the young age of 59. And it had to do 100% with his quest to make really solidify this idea of genocide in international law. So in 1933, he published a pamphlet on what he called barbarity and vandalism. And broadly speaking, barbarity kind of coincides with this idea of the physical killing of individuals, the physical destruction of individuals, whereas vandalism coincides more with what we think of today as cultural genocide. When we try and wipe out people's culture, their music, their language, think of re-education camps and so on. So because he used these terms because the word genocide did not yet exist, and we'll talk about that soon. But he wanted to present his pamphlet at the League of Nations Conference on International Criminal Law in Madrid, but he was banned from going there. He nonetheless sent his pamphlet to individuals attending that conference. But I think he parked this idea for a while, at least, because I think some of his work was disrupted by what was happening in Germany and on the rest of the continent. So, as you may know, in 1939, the Russians and the Germans came together and brokered this so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And that then was followed not long thereafter by the Nazi invasion of Poland on the 1st of September. And I think this really gives you an interesting idea of Lemkin's sort of sense of the moment, because he fled Warsaw on the 6th of September. He knew what was coming. I think he knew the writing was on the wall. And I think if you break it down into statistics, if you were Jewish living in Poland at that time, the chances that you would be killed would have been about 90%. So Lemkin really had a strong sense of the moment and decided he needed to get out of there. He then made his way to his parents, tried to persuade them to leave with him, and they said, "We're too old, we're staying." Um, Lemkin then made his way to the Baltics in order to get to Sweden. The Baltics were not yet occupied at the time. So he thought it was temporarily at least a safe haven. He started writing to one of his friends, a former Minister of Justice in Sweden, who then helped him to get a visa in order to go to Sweden. Lemkin then arrived in Sweden, and within 5 months of his arrival, he started teaching law at Stockholm University in Swedish. And that was typical Lemkin. He would go to a place, and on his way there, he'll start to learn the language and really emerge, and then be able to do things like that. I mean, it would be impossible for most of us to be able to teach in another language, even after 10 years. But here's Lemkin teaching in Swedish, like dry legal texts, which is quite impressive. But there, he then reached out to this incredible network that he established in the previous few years, where he worked with a number of corporate organizations and all over Europe. And he asked them, "Listen, can you send me any Nazi decrees or ordinances? And I would like to collect them." And he started collecting all these texts and documents and so on, because he thought he needed to collect the evidence. He needed to, have an idea of what was happening, analyze those. He started translating those, and he took those with him, those documents with him when he went to the United States later on. He then in Sweden started this letter writing campaign. He often shot off numerous letters all over the world to influential individuals. And one of the individuals that he approached was Dr. Malcolm McDermott, who was a professor, I want to say at Duke University. And Lemkin asked him if he could, help him to get to the US. He knew he needed to get to the US in order to promote his ideas related to genocide. McDermott then helped him to make his way to the US, and Lemkin fled to the US via the Soviet Union, and Japan, ended up at Duke University in 1941. And the story is that on his way to the US, he was learning English. Basically, he had a dictionary with him and started to practice to speak more and more English. And on the day of his arrival at Duke University, he gave a speech in English. And his main message was that the US needs to do more in order to stop Nazi Germany in its track. Then in the US, not long thereafter, after his arrival, he then made his way to Washington, D.C., where he met John Vance, who was a librarian at the Library of Congress. And Vance was a very kind of helpful figure to Raphael Lemkin, because he gave him a P.O. box at Library of Congress. So whenever people sent documents and things to Lemkin, Vance could collect it for him, and it could be stored. And that became really important later on, as Lemkin more systematically started to look at some of these crimes, and in the run-up to the Nuremberg trial also. In the US, Lemkin was also introduced to, he became known to Vice President Henry Wallace, who was on the US Board of Economic Warfare. Lemkin was asked to join that board. And he thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of convince Wallace of some of his genocide ideas. Wallace was not too interested in Lemkin's ideas. So Lemkin then went to the top. He said, "Well, if I can't influence Wallace, I'll engage F.D. Roosevelt on this issue." Roosevelt then replied to Lemkin to be "quote unquote" patient. And Lemkin said, "Well, while people are being slaughtered, you don't use the word patience." And so Lemkin, the typical negotiator, thought, well, if I can't influence Roosevelt, where do I go to? Who are the people who's influencing him? And he tried through Roosevelt's wife, of course, but he also then approached the public, and he started a massive campaign to publicize some of his ideas related to genocide. And he thought that the public would eventually put pressure on the US president in order to kind of change the tune on this issue. So one of his big efforts was the publication of Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, which was published in November 1944. And the significance of it is that, you know, not long before that, you know, Churchill in 41 was quoted as saying, "We're in the presence of a crime without a name." And so Lemkin kind of took it upon himself to coin a word that would really help to describe what was happening, to describe this crime that his law professor said did not exist, this crime that Churchill said has no name. And so Lemkin, the linguist, then you know, borrowed both from Greek and Latin. From Greek, the word genos, meaning race or tribe or religious group, and then side from Latin, meaning killing or destroying. And he experimented with a number of different words. You'll see there in the top left-hand corner, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. I do not speak Polish, but basically it means the killing of a group. It's a very difficult word for most of us, I bet, to pronounce. And maybe if you have a Polish speaker there, Polish speaker can help you with that. But the German word there underneath it, Völkermord, also translates directly to a nation, folk, or the nation, and mort, like a killing. But Lemkin was very cautious he was careful not to use that word, because he didn't want this idea of genocide strictly to be associated with the Holocaust. You know, he wanted a word. He argued that it's happened many times throughout history, and I think that was the point of his book also, to show that it's not just a crime that's happened, you know, that's happening during the Holocaust, but there are several other cases where he had seen the same thing. And so this note that you see on the right, you can see that he scribbled different words on that notepad, you know, to try and come up with the sort of almost perfect word, you know, a word that can't be mispronounced, a word that describes exactly what he intends it to describe, you know. So that is quite significant. He spent a lot of time thinking about that. And as I said, so with the publication of this Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, that was the first time that the word genocide then made its way into print. The book wasn't very well received. You know, it was a long, dry, legalistic kind of book. There were a few journalists who wrote reviews of the book, and they didn't make much of it. Lemkin, of course, I think the book was over 600 pages, 600 pages long. There was not that much that was really interesting to the public. So he realized soon he wasn't going to sell this idea to the public. So Lemkin, of course, which also made him a great negotiator, he listened to his critics. And so he then condensed the essence, the most important point of this book had to do with genocide, and he condensed that into a short article, Genocide, a Modern Crime. And so in 1945, he heard that Robert Jackson was going to be appointed as the chief prosecutor for the US on the Nuremberg trial. And he sent a letter to Jackson, and he attached this short condensed version, Genocide, a Modern Crime article, to Jackson and said, please read it, you know, and he implored on him to include the word genocide as a possible crime. Because remember, the four powers were negotiating the Nuremberg Charter, and they needed to decide what the Nazis would be charged with and then prosecuted and so on. And so there was no mention of genocide or anything. You know, in May all the way through October, suddenly, you know, the word genocide appears under count 3, under war crimes, not as genocide, but under war crimes. And it was defined almost exactly the way that Lemkin defined it in his Axis Rule. So it's described as the extermination of racial and national groups against the civilian populations of certain occupied territories in order to destroy particular races and classes of people and national, racial, or religious groups, particularly Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. So that was a huge coup for Lemkin, because this crime did not exist under international law. Then Lemkin followed the Nuremberg trial quite closely, and 130 days into the trial, there was still no mention of genocide. So he was quite disappointed. He then went into letter writing mode. He engaged Eleanor Roosevelt, Tocqueville, and so on, all these influential figures, and he said, put pressure on for help me to kind of publish this idea of genocide, and that the Nazis have to be prosecuted and for crimes, for this heinous crime. Lemkin even then made his way to Nuremberg. He had an audience with Jackson. He also met with a number of other prosecutors and the defense team and so on. And he wrote this paper, The Necessity to Develop the Concept of Genocide in the Proceedings. And not long thereafter, so his whole argument, by the way, is that this idea of mass murder or mass extermination is not good enough. It doesn't capture this idea of genocide, because genocide specifically has to do with intent, and we'll talk a lot more about intent in a moment. But not long thereafter, suddenly, prosecutors left, right, and center started to sprinkle in the word genocide throughout the Nuremberg proceedings, and it was used at least 15 times during the Nuremberg trial. However, to the disappointment of Lemkin, none of the Nazis were convicted specifically for genocide. They were convicted for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and people often have this concept in their head that they were convicted for genocide, but they were not. And Lemkin was quite disappointed, calling it the blackest day of my life. He ended up in a hospital in Paris, and he was quite depressed and ill. He literally worked himself to death in many ways, given that he died in 1959. But the reason why it was so important for him that the Nazis should also be convicted of genocide is that one of the sources of international law is relates to the proceedings of international courts and tribunals. And so Lemkin understood that the chances then of genocide being criminalized in accordance with international law would be very slim, because the Nazis were not convicted of this crime. Then there were just on a side note, the subsequent Nuremberg trials that happened shortly after these Nuremberg trials. And by the way, there were two judges who were they were convicted for genocide, but the crime genocide was not in the indictment. So there is a technicality involved in terms of that. Now, Lemkin turned to another source of international law, and this source particularly has to do with convention. So you can create international law if you can get enough states to agree that this is international law, which is exactly what he did. And so he lobbied the UN that they needed to create some form of a convention, and the UN voted and said genocide is a crime under international law. Lemkin then became part of a team to sort of draft this convention on genocide, and he relied on a whole range of individuals to help him to sort of stack the cards in order for him to be part of this process and to almost get a large chunk of what he wanted to achieve with this convention. So in 1948, the UN adopted the Genocide Convention on the prevention and the punishment of the crime of genocide. But remember, the UN still needed enough signatories. So in order to adopt, in order to breathe life into the Genocide Convention. So Lemkin worked really hard to get states not only to ratify the Genocide Convention, but also, not only to sign it, but also to ratify it. so that it's adopted, it becomes part of the national legislation of these different countries, and that so that they would be forced to enforce it in accordance with law. And basically, we'll return to the Genocide Convention, what it basically means. But these are the main acts of genocide. Remember, you don't get, you don't get convicted of genocide. You get convicted of acts of genocide if you're found guilty. But we'll return to what genocide essentially means momentarily. Then the convention entered into force on the 12th of January 1951. That's when basically enough states ratified the convention in order for it to become active. And then, as I mentioned, Lemkin died in 1959. He died very much alone and in poverty. Now, what's the relevance of Lemkin today? And I think that's the other part of the discussion that we need to focus on today. If you fast forward to 1998, the Rome Statute came into being. The Rome Statute, of course, forms the basis of the International Criminal Court, which started to become operative in 2002. And today there are 120 states that are party to the Rome Statute. But of course, there are many important states that are missing, that have not yet ratified the Rome Statute. But this idea, I think Lemkin was very realistic. Also, he knew that the Genocide Convention was not going to, end genocide immediately, but it is an important step, because today we can look at a variety of genocides happening around the world, and we can say, hey, there is actually a name for this crime. It's called genocide. Now let's turn a little bit to Russia, Ukraine, and I want to say something. Just talk a little bit about what Lemkin had to say about Russia and Ukraine during his lifetime. I think, and I need to kind of verify this. He made references to Soviet genocide in Ukraine in earlier years, but the most significant year that he wrote about this or that he talked about this was a speech that he gave in 1953, the Soviet genocide in Ukraine. And this quote is quite significant. I'll quickly read it. What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. This is only the logic successor of such czarist crimes as the drowning of 10,000 Crimean Tatars by the order of Catherine the Great, the mass murder of Ivan the Terrible's SS troops, the experimentation of national Polish leaders and Ukrainian Catholics by Nicholas I, and a series of Jewish pogroms that have sustained Russian history periodically. And it has had its matches with the Soviet Union in the annihilation of the Ingarian nation, the Don, the Kuban Cossacks, the Crimean Tatar republics, the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Each is a case in the long-term policy of liquidation of non-Russian people by the removal of select parts. Now, what's significant, I think, about this quote is that, one, he calls it the Soviet genocide, what's happening, what was happening in Ukraine, and we'll talk about what he was referring to. But he also situates it in the historical context. He says, this is what we've seen numerous times in Russian history, with the destruction of the Tatars. There were, pogroms against the Catholics and, against Jews, and he goes on and on. So he's situating it in historical context there. So it's not the first time that the Russians have committed genocide. I think that's one of the main points that he makes. So Lemkin then, in that speech, calls it a classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And his main argument is that as long as Ukraine exists, there is a national unity, and these individuals seek independence. That particularly, according to Lemkin, then poses a threat to this whole idea of a Soviet Union, to Sovietism. And so the Kremlin, he then argues, then pursues a ruthless policy of Russification, forcing other identity groups to use Russian, forcing others, to let go of their culture and become good Soviet citizens and so on. And Lemkin basically argues in relation to Ukraine, what the Soviets did was basically they did three main things. And this is in accordance with the speech that he mentioned these things. First, the elimination of intellectuals, religious leaders, and political figures. And he refers specifically in this article to a case in 1931 where over 50,000 of these intellectuals were sent to Siberia. And it's not just a physical killing. Again, I want to emphasize this. It's also when you take poets, when you take musicians, or when you take public or any intellectuals, who contribute to the culture of your people, and you remove them from society, it has a great impact on the ability of that culture, that people, to survive. And for Lemkin, that was one of the greatest crimes in history. The second kind of act of genocide that he mentioned was this demographic manipulation. So there were many Ukrainians deported, from Ukraine to other parts of the Soviet Union. Many of them were also killed, and so he witnessed this kind of just change. There were only 63% Ukrainians in 1939 living in Ukraine versus 80% in 1920. So how did that happen? And that could only happen through demographic manipulation. And then last but not least, he talks about the starvation as a brutal weapon. And the word Holodomor did not exist at the time, but Holodomor literally translates to the killing by starvation. And so he referred to Holodomor specifically in that context as physical evidence also of a genocide taking place over there. Now, today, fast forward to today, in terms of Russia, Ukraine, there's a popular saying in Russia, "We can do it again," and it used to be an old World War II slogan, but it's been changed into this, sort of an impending threat to Ukraine. We can do it again. What does it mean? Does it mean Ukrainians will be starved once more, by Russia? Like what happened during Holodomor, or what does that exactly mean? And I think there are a number of legal scholars who have come together and argued that at the very least, Russia is guilty of incitement of genocide. And you can break down each of these different sort of crimes and look at a variety of aspects to come to the conclusion that genocide is happening in Ukraine. There is first and foremost this denial of Ukrainian identity. President Putin made a number of speeches, like most significantly just before the February escalation, arguing that the Ukrainian and the Russian people are, quote unquote, fundamentally one people. Medvedev, for example, also said the Ukrainian nation does not exist. It is a political orientation requiring the liquidation of the Ukrainian statehood in its current form. So on the one hand, the Ukrainian identity is denied. On the other hand, they're also painted as just, they are actually Russians. They're just misguided. They need to be sort of, we need to just get their minds ready again, and they'll come back to the table again. The other issue is this, what they call accusation in a mirror. So Russia, for example, has accused Ukraine of acquiring nuclear and chemical weapons and whatnot, but at the same time, Russia is threatening constantly to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So what you do in this kind of situation is you keep on accusing your opponent of the crimes that you actually are committing, or that you threaten to commit, and we've seen that time again during this war. There's also, thirdly, this dehumanizing the dehumanization of Ukrainians. The Russians talk about, well, we need to denazify Ukraine. this idea that, you know, or they're trying to paint Ukrainians as Nazis and therefore justify that they can go in and you know, get rid of fascism in Ukraine. When that didn't work, and when, you know, a lot of people pointed out, well, you know, President Zelensky is actually Jewish. You know, how can he be, you know, a president of a Nazi state? You know, the Russians changed their tune. Now the Kremlin's presenting this idea of de-Satanizing Ukraine. You know, they're Satanists, so we should go in and you know, de-Satanize the place. You know, they've also referred to Ukrainians as roaches, in a manner. You know, it's really important. Words matter. You know, because when you dehumanize another group of people, you know, it's easier than to kill them in the long run. You know, because you know, you can squash a cockroach with your shoe, you know, without hesitation. It's a lot harder to kill someone if you think of that person as a human being. So it sets up many of the atrocities that are happening on the battleground today. And then there's this construction of Ukrainians as an existential threat. Well, either we kill Ukrainians or they will come to Russia and kill us, you know. So it's sort of stirring up the conflict in many ways. And then finally, this is related to what was said earlier, this conditioning of Russian audience to commit atrocities, you know, which relates to the dehumanization that I mentioned earlier. And you can go through each of these acts of genocide, you know. I'll very briefly talk about them because I don't think we have a lot of time left. But we have seen on the battleground the killing of members of a group. You know, we have seen some mass killings, mass murders in Bucha and Azim and other places. You know, we've uncovered those bodies. You know, that's well documented. UNHCR, you know, has said there are over 9,000 civilians that have been killed. You know, and their only crime is because they were Ukrainians. They were not, you know, killed because they were soldiers. They were killed because they were Ukrainians. In Bucha, you know, a lot of people were found in mass graves with their hands tied behind their backs. A lot of those people are women and children. The other big act of genocide here that we've seen during this war is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and specifically Ukrainians that we're talking about here. So there are many reported cases of industrialized torture. In Kherson, for example, there are over 1,000 survivors of torture. There are 400 of them that are missing. And I think the longer this war continues and as certain areas are being liberated from Russia, we'll see more evidence of industrialized torture. There are many cases of rape and sexual violence that's already been documented. And the victims of those crimes are between 4 and 82-year-olds. There are many nuclear threats, because here we're talking about bodily and mental harm. You have to remember Ukraine was victim to one of the greatest nuclear disasters of the 20th century, civilian ones, I should say. And Russia has also kind of capitalized on that to put pressure on the Russians. They've made at least 12 direct threats saying, we are going to use nuclear weapons against you. They've also used 24 indirect threats, you know, where they're kind of hinting, well, you know, we could use nuclear weapons against you, you know. And then that's just from government officials. We're not talking about the media here. Then, you know, some of the frontline cities like Donetsk and Kharkiv, those cities have had over 1,000 hours that they've been on alert. You know, so in the middle of the night, suddenly all the sirens goes off, you know, and they go off, and then you have to like get into a bunker or find a place of safety. That does serious mental harm to your physical being. And then we've seen a lot of attacks on critical infrastructure, particularly electricity, for example. You know, the electrical grid of Ukraine has been constantly under attack. All these power facilities, you know, and this is very serious because you know, on average, Ukraine's temperature ranges between 23 and 36 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can imagine in the winter, you know, that it's really tough being without power. You know, some people could freeze to death, you know. This is just graffiti I have there on the right. It says, "It doesn't count as a war crime if you had fun. With a happy smile, I will burn foreign villages." So that just shows you some of the impact, of these messages, these threats. It's part of the mental harm to the Ukrainian people. Then the next act here has to do with inflicting conditions on a certain group of life that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And so, of course, we've seen specifically the killing of Ukrainians. We've seen large-scale displacement, large-scale deportation, attacks on critical infrastructure, like I mentioned earlier. And to give you a statistic here, there have been over 5,000 cruise missiles and countless artillery rockets launched against cities and towns. There have been over 1,000 attacks on healthcare systems. And some of these hospitals, I should add, have the word hospital or children, written on the rooftop, and still the Russians keep on bombing those positions. There are also, Ukraine is also victim to blockades, especially the Black Sea blockade, which is really important because it also, has parallels with Holodomor, and this death by starvation. Ukraine, one of its biggest forms of sources of income is to export food to other places. So it's really serious. And then there are certain cities that are completely cut off from humanitarian aid, like Mariupol, Luhansk, Zaporizhia. All those places have at some point, been cut off completely from receiving humanitarian aid. So that of course directly relates to the physical destruction also of people, if people at some point start to starve. The Ukrainian prosecutor has documented over 88,000 war crimes. 40% of Ukrainian territory has been mined. That also does significant mental damage also, that we talked about this previous crime, the mental harm. But that obviously leads to thousands of amputations. There are, in some of these mass graves, some people, there are booby traps put in some of those areas so that when people move a body, there would be like a mine exploding, causing further harm. There's just to show you part of the destruction. And then imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. There are many systematic. I mean, it's quite clear, and this is independent bodies have come to the conclusion that there are cases of systemic rape and gender-based violence in Ukraine by Russian forces. Several women have been gang raped, for example, for several days on end. I won't go into the gory detail, but I do want you to be aware of that. There's been castration of men also. That also directly prevents the birth within a group. There are cases where men's genitals have been tied to electric cables and shocked, so all those things relate to this particular crime. And then finally, this is one of the most easiest crimes, I think, that we have, one of the clearest crimes that I think that's been documented so far, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So Ukraine, so there's like wide discrepancy here between the numbers, and I don't know the details of everything, but I think the one thing to take into consideration is that the Ukrainian government has already verified over 20,000 cases of Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped, from Ukraine and taken to Russia. Russia has announced, and I think my figure here is low. I think they've announced over 750,000 children that they've taken from Ukraine and resettled in Russia. Russia passed legislation to make it very easy for these children to be adopted. They don't have to have consent from the parents or the guardians. They do not have to have the consent of the children. So these kids are just like taken to Russia. I don't know if they're renamed or whatever. It's very hard to then, find them later on. But and then they're given a re-education. They grow up Ukrainian one day, and suddenly, next day they are taught that they are Russians and they have to sing Russian patriotic songs. And then I'm almost done. But I think the key thing about genocide is that you have to show that there is intent intent to destroy the Ukrainian national group in whole or in part. And this is very important. When people often think about genocide, they think about the Holocaust, they think about the Rwandan genocide that led to, the killing of nearly 1 million, Tutsis. It's not just about, it's not whether you have like high numbers of people being killed. If the intent is to destroy, quote unquote, destroy in whole or in part, the part that says in part tells you that you don't have to destroy every single Ukrainian in order, to commit genocide. You can kill some of them, but if the intent is there, then that's really important. So of course, it's very hard to prove intent, and I think lawyers will debate this issue for years to come in relation to Ukraine. But I think, the Russian authorities have been quite open about what they intend to do in Ukraine, which may make it relatively, I don't want to say easy, but I think it gives an opportunity for prosecutors in the future, to show causality between those kind of things. And then just very important, genocide is not strictly about killing. It's not just about killing people. It's also about the destruction of a people, and to give you sort of an example of what Lemkin said, if you destroyed the English, for example, you wouldn't have Shakespeare, so think about, the figures, the prominent figures in your own culture, in your, in your own nation. If you destroy the entire nation, you won't have those figures. You won't have that type of music or that poetry or literature or whatever the case may be, and so I think the main point is it's not just about physical killing. It's also destroying other parts of our culture. So if you take children from Ukraine and you kidnap them and you take them to Russia, and suddenly they get a Russian education, you Russify them, you're destroying their culture, because they have nothing left anymore of their Ukrainianness and what it means to be Ukrainian. There's also, we've talked about mass executions, torture, the destruction of infrastructure, rape and sexual violence. We've talked about all those things, so I won't rehash it. I think, kind of to conclude here, the Genocide Convention compels us to, first and foremost, prevent genocide from taking place. And if we've identified it, also to stop it. And there have been different forms of trying to prevent or stop genocide in Ukraine. First and foremost, through travel bans, sanctions. Some Western countries are supplying Ukraine with weapons, of course, and then giving a lot of humanitarian support to Ukraine. So those are some of the measures we have taken in response to all this. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry if I talk too much, but we had a lot to cover. Thank you.